welcome back, and thank you, John. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Jim Young, for having me back. How time flies. It's about 6 months since the first part of this lecture. Well, I wanted to continue where we left off, half a year ago. So this is part two of the fabled Kingdom of Zhang Zhung. Tonight I'll speak for about an hour. I want us to have fun. It's the holiday season, and so we're gonna, we'll look at quite a few things. We won't be able to go into great depth, but this lecture is all designed not just to inform but to inspire people, so that more people can be, get involved with the research and exploration if they are so equipped. So, let's go from where I left off half a year ago. I mean, I had mentioned that these are my basic aspects of the talk, and we got as far as monuments last time. So we're going to go over today. We're going to look at the rock art artifacts, significance of the findings, and links with surrounding cultures. And the big question: is this Zhang Zhung? So let's see. Let us. I think most people here will be familiar with Tibet and the surrounding area in Asia. So this is the dark area here in the middle is Tibet, so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. But Tibet, of course, extends into Amdo and Kham. It's a very large area, about 2.5 million square kilometers. And got India here to the south, and the Central Asian republics. East Turkestan here, Mongolia to the north, of course, and Siberia to the north. Here is a Tibetan Plateau again, kind of a topographic view. And today we're going to be looking, if you can see all these blue bits on the map, these are large lakes, mostly salt lakes, on the Chungtung and in Western Tibet. And this is the area, the focus of the talk today. And I threw this in here. This is a map, really. It takes us from the Tibetan Plateau here and all the way to the Arctic Ocean. So in between are, of course, places like the Taklamakan Desert, Tarim Basin, East Turkestan, and here in northern regions, northwest regions of China, which 2,000 years ago or more were non-Han at that time. And then to the north, we have southern Siberia, Lake Baikal here, one of the deepest freshwater lakes in the world, the Altai, and of course Mongolia to the east, and to the west we have Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, in northern Pakistan, and bits of Afghanistan. So this is really all Inner Asia. And that's what we're going to be looking at also today. So we're going to be looking at Tibet, Upper Tibet, in relation to the rest of Eurasia. Oh, this is basically a map based on my research here, outlining what might be considered Zhang Zhung, according to the monuments and rock art of this region. Anyway, this was an integral culture in the pre-Buddhist period before the 7th century. And it came to be known as Zhang Zhung in the 6th and 7th centuries. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. And here we have a wider, we see the whole plateau and the wider area. East Turkestan, important region that interacted with the plateau extensively in early times. And I threw these in here too. So according to Burn sources, Yungdrung Burn sources, the innermost part of Zhang Zhung was made up of 3 mountain lake dyads. You have Nenchen Tangla and Namso, Dargol and Tangra Yumso in the center, and in the west, of course, Tise, or Mount Kailash, and Langatso. Langatso, in terms of the archaeology and Burn history and mythology, is more important than Manasarovar. Of course, often in Buddhist and Hindu reckonings, Langatso is considered a demonic lake, but in early times it was a very important center civilization, closely wed to Mount Kailash. This picture is actually taken from one of the island bastions in Langatso, where there are pre-Buddhist ruins. And then I kept this up too, just, we have a quick review here. Some of the people of the region. So I think, it's important to link history and archaeology with what's happening today. And because we know in genetic terms that the people of today share much of their genetic patrimony with people that live on the plateau 3 to 5 thousand years ago. And there are even earlier lineages going this, as far back as the old Stone Age. But essentially, the Tibetans of today are genetically um, the same or very similar to Tibetans of 3 to 5 thousand years ago. Same people, essentially. So the methods, I won't go over each one of these. I want to take us to the more exciting parts of the talk so we can look at cool things. But anyway, so here's the methods I use. These are the objectives. I'm, trying to figure out where Upper Tibet fits in the larger map of Eurasia, understand, the economics, ancient economics and politics, cultural system of early times, and, through the rock art uh, and monuments, etc., early objects, material culture of early times, as archaeologists do. Here's a chronology once again. So we're going to be mainly talking today about the late prehistoric era, which ranges from the late Bronze Age, circa 1200 BC, through the proto-historic period to about 600 AD. And moving right along, last time we looked at some of these residential monuments of different types that circumscribe this huge region of Upper Tibet, which is about 700,000 square kilometers. Various kinds of archaic monuments, residential monuments, and other types found there, including ceremonial, ritual monuments, burial monuments. So we looked at a lot of these last time. At least we came as far as the pillars, as you might remember. And so today we're going to look at some of the tombs. We'll look very briefly at agricultural structures and rock art, epigraphy, earthworks. We won't look at that. Those are found in the Zhang Zhung area. We won't be looking at that today. And the rock inscriptions is really another talk. And this talk is, we just want to have fun here. It's the holiday season, as I said. We're going to go over things, skim over, sort of like a bird, flies through the air, kind of give you a global view and inspire you. This talk could be made into about a 3 or 4 hour lecture series, but we, of course, are going to keep it to an hour. And so we won't be able to go into great depth on everything, but we'll look at a lot of stuff. And I think that is also a very good method. This is the slide we didn't see last time. This is part of one of those giant necropolises, one of the temple tombs, appended to hundreds, in some cases, thousands of standing stones. So this is where we left off last time. So let's continue here. So here's some of the types of tombs and funerary structures, superstructures found in Upper Tibet. And it's not clear often what is under the ground. Often there is something under the ground, but they may be shallow pits with no discernible remains in some cases. But there are various types of slab wall structures, enclosures, some with built walls, also these prominent structures with standing stones, slab walls that stick prominently out of the ground. These just give you a flavor of some of the funerary structures, because many of the objects we're going to be looking at today came from tombs. And a few more, here we have the funerary mounds found in Upper Tibet. They're quite different than those found in Central Tibet. 1 and 2, cubic tombs found on tops of mountains with central depositories. And 4 is an open tomb. You can see this was a cist burial with large stone slabs overlying the burial chamber, the lined walls. This was opened by a road crew, unfortunately. So this really, in a nutshell, is some of the many types of funerary structures, including tombs, found in Tibet. So just keep this in mind, because we're going to be looking at a lot of interesting artifacts here at the moment. I want to briefly go to agriculture because Western Tibet is full of old architecture which no longer is being farmed, cultivated. In some places, there were large settlements, and now there is virtually nothing. The land has gone entirely fallow. Often the water sources have disappeared, which points to why much of this land now has become defunct, is because there isn't sufficient water to farm. But at one time, particularly in far western Tibet, there was a lot of farming going on, which provided an important economic base for the people, and of course, grain, barley, to feed folks. And we see here some defunct agricultural lands in Gar. And we talk about such places exist all over far western Tibet. Many thousands of hectares of abandoned farmland, and abandoned in various periods, some in ancient times and some even quite recently, because unfortunately the water supplies are still dwindling, and even the areas that are still farmed are not farmed as intensively as they were in many cases, even 50 or 100 years ago, according to the oral accounts. And so keep this also in mind that, Tibet at one time, Western Tibet was a agrarian region that produced, formidable supplies of grain, which potentially supported a population larger than the population in pre-modern times. Okay, let's start here. So this is basically just to pick your interest. We see two visages here, one in red ochre and one in bronze. The one on the right is part of a bronze plaque. The one on the left, the red ochre pictograph, is from Namso. But we can see here in two very different mediums, very similar types of countenances, faces. And so we're going to be skimming a world that at one time was very vast and diverse and complex. And so when you're looking at the artifacts, just see it as a looking glass, as a window into a world that no longer exists, but a world that was rich and varied, as rich and varied in many respects as Tibet of the Buddhist era. We talked about this last time because we're going to be looking a lot of the artifacts we'll be looking at come from Guge and the cemeteries, pre-Buddhist cemeteries that have been explored there in the last 20 years. And Guge and other parts of Tibet share many qualities in common, as I pointed out in the first part of the talk. There are also some distinctive differences. And interesting enough, in Yungjung Bun's sources, they mentioned that Guge was quite a part. It was part of Shangshung, part of the what was known as the region of Kayuk, but it had some distinctive qualities all of its own. And of course, Guge is a lower lying region. It's a region of badlands and very complex network of alluvial valleys that drain into the Sutlej, right on the border with India, with the Himalaya, of course, between Guge and the subcontinent. So let us go right now, without further ado, to a region known as Kardungan Gurujam. This is in Gar County, not too far, about 50, 60 kilometers northwest of Mount Kailash. And these little numerals here point to 4 important archaeological sites. And we're going to be looking particularly at 2, the Gurujam burials. This is Kardung. This is the fortress there, which appears to be the Kyunglung-Nukar, the capital of Shangshung, mentioned in old Tibetan sources. So even going back not much after the fall of Shangshung in the early mid 7th century, we have sources that point to Kuala being the capital, and for many reasons, which we can't really go over tonight, this evening. Kardong is the most likely candidate for the ancient capital of Shangshung. That, according to uh, later bone sources, several Shangshung kings were based. So we're going to now look at some of the work done by Chinese archaeologists in the last 20 years or so. And particularly, we're going to be looking at these pit tombs in Gurjam, which are dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. And these tombs there's a number of them. They're 4 to 6 meters deep. So with chambers, stone-lined chambers in the bottom, and they were filled with earth above, and they contain complex arrays of organic remains, skeletal remains of humans and animals, and various types of objects in the main burial chamber and also along the shelves. Now, most of these burial chambers were heavily disturbed and had partially or entirely collapsed. So the actual location of many of the artifacts is not very clear. Now, these tombs contain often wooden coffins and for the repository of bones, and in some cases it would appear artifacts. This is a cleaned up version the Chinese published, and we can see various types of basketry, cane, and other objects here, textiles, etc. Now, of course, in all what you might see if you're not an archaeology, among all this muck would be very, important botanical and zoological evidence potentially. I don't know how much of this was preserved, and doesn't seem so much in some cases, particularly here in Gurjam, which were first explored by the Chinese 2011, 2012. So, some of this deposits here would be very valuable, in understanding the artifacts and the processes behind the burial and the industries involved in the creation of these various objects. But we can only do so much. I'm not part of this excavation, part of this team, so I can only base myself on what I can see and on the Chinese reports. Now, before we look at the artifacts, objects found at Gurjam, I want to just point out that recently we know at the site of Gepa Siru, also in Gugay in far western Tibet, they've discovered assemblages of copper and arsenical copper tools and ornaments dating back to around 1400, 1300 BC. And so this evidence is very, very important. Actually, the full range of the first phases, circa 1600 to 1100 BC, according to radiocarbon dates provided by the Chinese archaeologists. And so this is very important because it takes the use of metal items as adornment and tools and various other economic functions back to the Central Asian Bronze Age, to the end of the Bronze Age, and of course to the late Bronze Age. So this is very important. This essentially is the what we know right now, and this is very recent discoveries of what we know about early metallurgy, copper metallurgy in Tibet. Now, also in Ludrak, in Mustang in Nepal, there were 2 slab schist graves. They contained many ceramic objects, carnelian, glass, beads, etc. And copper rings and bangles. So this is another early site going back to the late Bronze Age, which clearly shows that in that period, in the late Bronze Age, the second half of the second millennium BC, people in Western Tibet, including Mustang, were actively using a variety of metal tools. Now, this is really, I think, just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably many other sites, some still to be discovered, with caches of early copper and even bronze objects. Now we will go to the burials and look at what we're finding there. These on the left are from Gurjam and dated again to the second and believed to date to the second and third century, according to the archaeological reports. And these are copper alloy or probably bronze vessels. And there's a variety of types here. So we see these cauldron types. We see like a dipper. We see here a jar with a flared mouth. Here we have a ringed cup with a ring handle. And here we have kind of a spherical bowl. And, so we see a variety, and there are other types that were found in Guge, in far Western Tibet. So we see a variety of metallic vessels that were used, so gives us an inkling of the richness of the material culture, of 1900 years ago. On the right is from Sangdarlung, which is discovered more recently, which is the most extensive Cree Buddhist cemetery that has been excavated to date in far Western Tibet. Until Sangdarlung several years ago, the largest was Gurujam, these objects here on the left. But now we have even a larger cemetery at Sangdarlung, which is located, interesting enough, just across the Sutlej River from Toling Monastery, the Buddhist mother monastery of Western Tibet, founded in 996 of the Common Era. And here we see what appears to be a copper or brass ornaments. We have several reports, but they're very preliminary, would provide very little data descriptions of the art of the amazing artifacts that have been found in Sangdarlungo. We'll come back to metal objects, but here we will look a little bit at, again, just for the variety of, and so of ceramic vessels. And these if you see the variety here of jars, goblets, amphorae-like vessels, etc., we can see, and there are more types that were found in Western Tibet, but this is a sample of what was found. We see that they were used for a variety of purposes, again, indicating the richness of early culture in Western Tibet in the early part of this Common Era, and we have ceramics going even further back, also of considerable variety, dating to the second half of the first millennium BC. And so ceramics, of course, are very important indicators of culture, cultural affiliation, of the expression of culture and the extent of culture all over the world. So they're really kind of a gold standard object used by archaeologists to understand peoples of early times. I think it's important to point out that the ceramics of Western Tibet are most closely aligned with those of Ladakh and Spiti. The ceramics of Central Tibet are quite different. It's only when you get to around Lhasa in the western part of Central Tibet do we start seeing amphorae similar to those found in um, far western Tibet. So keep this in mind. Again, diversity, richness, complexity of the material remains found in the tombs in western Tibet. We now are looking at various uh, other objects. We have sword. We have a sword here. We have an iron iron spearhead. I believe it's iron. If I remember correctly. We have a dipper or some other type of ladle in a copper alloy material. We have arrowheads with the tanged arrowheads, which I speak about in one of my books. And you can see again, these objects could have been used, of course, in the funerary rituals, but also used in real life as tools and weapons, in the case of the projectiles. And in the bottom, we see the gold and gilt masks, gilt silver masks. On the one on the left is painted. The one on the right was probably painted too. These are smaller than life size, as you can see here. They were not the size. They're smaller than an adult human head, and often they were crumbled. If we use archaic funerary rituals that have been preserved in Tibetan texts, such as the Mucho Tromdor, these kind of visages, human faces, are mentioned and under the lakor, under the soul circles, and the subgrouping of namka, or what we call in the West spirit catchers. But these spirit catchers are in the form of faces, and they talk about a golden face also in the early funerary rituals in the Mucho Tromdor. And so it would appear, looking at the textual evidence, even though the textual evidence was recorded more than 1,000 years later, it would appear that such masks, smaller than life-size masks, were used in the evocation rituals. And once the evocational rituals were consummated and the soul was sent off to the afterlife, retrieved if necessary from the underworld, and sent off to the afterlife, then these were no longer needed, and they were folded, crumpled, and placed in the tomb, at least in some cases. Now here we have on the left the most spectacular gilt silver mask found in Guge. These golden masks, similar ones, have been of this style have been found in Mustang, but this is a very unique one here, very detailed, with repose figures. We'll look at it a little more closely in a moment, with very long nose bridge, oval eyes. And on the right, we go back to Sangdar Lungo, and we look at there are a number of these wooden figures. They may be effigies that were used in the funerary rituals. In the textual, in the archaic rituals recorded in Tibetan text, they refer to a soap as a kind of substitute dead person used in rituals of protection and valediction. And it's possible that these served as soap or as effigies, replacements, substitutes in rituals for the deceased. Now, I want to look at this mask. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to look here at this mask, and we look at the upper band here of the Chutak mask found in the tomb in Chutak, probably dating to around 2,000 years ago. We see these three wild ungulates. They look like wild sheep to me, with the curling tail. There are also birds. and what appeared birds, four, two, four, six birds, two of them in two pairs, and then these three-step structures, which if you didn't know any better, you would think it was a stupa or a chorten. But according to Jung Burn sources, in early times there were step structures known as sekar or laten that were used to enshrine deities during various types of rituals. The early archaic funerary texts rituals also mention trees. They mention the head tree, which was used to suppress demons and to you slowly but surely raise up the soul of the dead to the afterlife. Um, so we cannot directly correlate these birds and the trees and the sheep to the funerary rituals in the text, but clearly there's a correspondence, even though there's a 1,000-year discrepancy in some cases between them. So you might see the text as a guide to interpreting what these various figures meant, but not in a hard and fast way, more in a generalized, non-specific fashion. So really quite amazing. As again, Chopel, the famous historian of the early 20th century, pointed out, the Tibetan chorten or stupa owes much of its existence to these earlier types of step structures. Now, Tibet did not exist in a vacuum, and so here are gold masks from two adjoining areas of Inner Asia, North Inner Asia. These are a little later than the masks we were looking at, and quite different in construction, but they give you an idea. These golden funerary masks were used throughout Inner Asia in burial rites. So Tibet was not alone. And of course, we have the earlier masks from the late Bronze Age in as far west as Thrace and Mycenae, and of course also in the east in the Shu Kingdom and the Sichuan Basin. There are also golden masks that were used in the Bronze Age for in funerary customs and rites. So we're just kind of taking a little survey here. Can't spend a lot of time in every object, but I just want to, as I said, kind of inspire you to see that Tibet, even before the time of Buddhism, was a quite civilized place, a place with an advanced culture and advanced manufacturing and society and politics, etc., as reflected in the objects here and the processes that the objects embody. Here we have a mirror, quite spectacular. It's reportedly discovered in Nagchu County, which is part of Upper Tibet. I would date it to the Iron Age or early part of the Protohistoric period. It's part of a Lhasa collection. You can see rabbits. Rabbits also figure quite importantly in Iron Age bronzes from North Inner Asia. We see a central ring of yak or wild yak, and then three unidentified creatures in the middle. Gives you an idea here. This is a sophisticated piece of metal to mold and model and create this took considerable metallurgical skills. So, we were talking earlier about the metallurgy now being shown on the plateau to probably go back as far as 15 or 1600 BC. And I believe some of those early objects were actually made in Upper Tibet or in Mustang. Even though they share similarities with North Inner Asian bronzes. So really quite quickly, within 1,000 years or so, from the introduction of bronze metallurgy in Tibet, they had a highly developed, highly mature industry going on. Now, again, none of this exists in isolation. This is a slide I took from an earlier talk I had given at Berkeley some years ago. We can see these copper ally mirrors, Tibetan, and then copper ally mirrors of the Scytho-Siberian culture. These date from third to the seventh century, seventh to the third century BC. We see quite similar, and these are often found in tombs. Some of these ancient copper ally um, melong or mirrors, ritual mirrors from Tibet were probably found in tombs too, but a lot of these ended up in the antique market, and so their provenance is is not assured. But we see similar types of instruments being used for still unclear purposes in Tibet. But Tibet saw fit to either emulate or innovate ritual mirrors very close to those found in other parts of Inner Asia. Likewise, with these kind of buttons or discs, the top row are from Tibet. The bottom row here, the bottom three rows of drawings of objects are from the Slab culture, a archaeological culture that existed in eastern Mongolia from roughly 1100 to 400 BC. So it seems as though these Tibetan objects, which are later than the ones from the Slav culture, emulated metallic forms found in North Inner Asia, and adapted them and created new but related metal objects for Tibet, used as ornaments and other unknown functions. So we see, the Upper Tibet did not exist in a vacuum. Now, this is a private collection also. This is an amazing piece, really. It's an ornamental cheek piece with a raptor head and a scimitar-like talon. And this seems to, again, have been inspired. Where this object was found is not clear. Almost certainly it's Tibetan, but inspired clearly by a very popular genre of replica wooden bridles found in Scytho-Siberian burials. So this particular one here is from the Pazyryk V, probably dating to third or fourth century BC. And we can see here the two bird-like with a talon figures of similar to the one in metal. The Tibetan one, the ostensibly Tibetan one, is more stolid, heavier in construction, and not as gracefully, modeled as the examples from the Scytho-Siberian cultures in the Altai. But again, we see certain resonances in design and probably function. This is a copper alloy bridle that I donated to the Tibet Museum. It was in the antiques market. Some of my friends came up with the money. I purchased it, and we donated it to the Tibet Museum in Lhasa, and it's now being proudly displayed there. Very complex item with these ornamental plates of unknown function. This is also believed to have been found in a tomb in Nagchu, according to the reports. So we see here more evidence for a highly developed cultural system in the Iron Age, long before the rise of Buddhism in the 7th century. And then I added this in. I thought it was kind of fun. This is from the Mucho Tomdor and one of the archaic funerary texts. These texts, of course, have been adapted to Lamayas, to later religious practice, but they contain certain practices and myths, rituals from earlier times. And so we have this excerpt. Whose horse bridle and lead was it in ancient times? It was the lead and bridle of Yemun Gelpo. He's a cosmogonic deity, cosmogonic deity, yes. Today, whose bridle and lead is it? It is the bridle and lead of this dead one. So very interesting. They mention the use of bridles and horse leads ritually in the text. And this, as I noted, this bridle is reported to have been found in a tomb. Let's continue here, looking at these objects. From these are actually from Eastern Tibet, but these are handled knives. This is also, in terms of metallurgy, very important indicator of cultural affiliation all through Eurasia. They made in the Iron Age these loop-handled knives. They're in different styles and they have different forms, but they're found all over the place. They have also, it's reported to me by Chinese archaeologists, though they're a little different in form, have been found in Nagchu. And so loop-handled knives extended into it, or so it seems, into Upper Tibet. These knives were also donated by me. The money came from my late friend, Dr. McCallan, and we donated these to the museum. Unfortunately, nothing has been heard of them or seen of them for many years. I hope the museum still has them because they're important in their own right, even though they don't have a clear provenance. We go back now to Guru Jam, including, in addition to brass, bronze, arsenical, copper items. There gold, gilt gold. There's also silver-clad objects, different wooden objects, as we saw, cane, glass beads, wheel-shaped glass beads, patterned agates. This is known as a tadzi, or tasozi, I should say, the horse-tooth Z. And so we have a clear indication of a type of highly prized stone in Tibet. It's showing that they go back, at least to the 2nd century of the Common Era. Here we have what looks to me to be carnelian beads of various shapes, and beads are very important for, again, like loop-handled knives and ceramics. They're an important indicator of where items came from, and you can trace trade routes and manufacturing centers through beads, through glass and stone beads. This is kind of cool. This is glass and stone beads. They were collected by local monks at Kardong, the putative Karlong Ngukar, the capital of Zhang. And here we see glass and other types of beads, maybe also jet, what seems to me to be carnelian, and other types of stone and beads. And they've picked up 2 pieces of clear quartz here. So a variety of objects, and these objects here probably came from many different sources. Very interesting. So this again is a glimmer of the richness of early Tibet. I know much less about textiles, silk textiles, but this was found in one of the Gurjam burials. And we can see it has various pairs of animals. Very nice silk item, earlier than most of those found in East Turkestan, Xinjiang. So they had there are also taffeta silk and other kinds of silk and woolen textiles found in the various cemeteries of Guge. And I think for an overview of the cemeteries of Guge that we're speaking of, would be people, if they have viewers if they haven't already, should listen to the talk by Mark Aldendorfer a well-known archaeologist, and his talk was hosted by the Zhang Zhung Institute. I think he gave it back in June of this year, and he gives an overview and the dating of the various cemeteries there. So that will help give you a little bit more context, which I don't have time to give you this evening. So we're gonna have to move quite quickly now because we only have a few minutes. We started a little late, so I will speak till 8:05 p.m. and then I'll take questions. So we'll go 5 minutes over because we started 5 minutes late, if that's okay. So I want to look a little bit at rock art sites and other things too. These are some of the rock art sites I have documented in the last 25 years or so. And all over Upper Tibet, this vast area here, extending from Namso all the way to the borders of India, there are rock art, and much of this rock art is very closely aligned. And here's a, quite spectacular example. We see the sun, the crescent moon, the swastika, the crescent moon, the sun, and the swastika here in Guge. This one on the left in Namso. They're separated by 1,500 kilometers, but the symbolism, the religious connotations, very closely aligned all through Upper Tibet. And there are many indicators of this, including the monuments we looked at in the first part of the talk. These are mascoids, these far western Tibet, Bronze Age, late Bronze Age. These are kind of, mascoid is a term that the Soviets coined, Soviet archaeologists. They're found all over Inner Asia, and they're in each region, in each cultural province. They are different. They're designed differently, but they consist of human-like faces, sometimes with appendages and full bodies. So these are a really interesting marker of the area. So Upper Tibet was not alone; it was part of a greater world. These are boulders clad, covered in mascoids of various kinds. The one on the left I stole from my book, the forthcoming book on rock art here, volume 3 of the series, and these mascoids are kind of very, each one is unique. They're peculiar. They're designed in a peculiar way. Their function, their symbolism behind is not well known. But here is just, the bottom row are Tibetan, the upper row, we have Ningxia, Ladakh, and Mongolia. They're also found in southern Siberia. And so, for whatever reason, the face, these stylized faces and bodies in Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, were an important marker, cosmopolitan marker of cultures all through Inner Asia. Likewise, the chariot. And here we see the chariots from Western Tibet, Guge, Western Changtung. But also, I put in there are many of these. There are hundreds, many hundreds of these carved chortens in southeastern Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia. As I said, southern Siberia, the northwest China, which of course was not Han at that time. What I refer to, some archaeologists refer to as the northern zone, but they all had or knew of wheeled vehicles. And we see this one here from Siberia and this one here from Western Tibet. The charioteer is depicted. And this charioteer, I have a close-up picture, but not here, appears to have a horned headdress or helmet. And so at that time, this wheeled vehicle was a sign of cultural interaction, technological interaction, but also probably of ideological cross currents that spread throughout Inner Asia, all throughout the Inner Asia region. Chariots, of course, go back to about 2,000 years in the Sintasha culture of Western Siberia, but not, and they spread rapidly throughout all of Eurasia, reached Anyang in China, the capital of Shang, China, around 1250 BCE. And of course, as we can see here, particularly these early type, uh, ostensibly early type, they also reached Tibet around the same time, and certainly by the Light Bronze Age. So chariots, a marker of ancient culture, prehistoric cultures. So, and likewise for the Iron Age, we see this Eurasian animal style, and we see these are black and white drawings of Eurasian style animal art from Tibet. In the upper row, you have Upper Tibet, or on the left, and you have Zhang Zhung uh, on the might be part of Songtsen. We'll talk about that in a moment. Northeastern Tibet, maybe it's part of now part of what was known as Sumpa, and then Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and southern Siberia variants at the bottom. And we're going to zip through now so we don't go over. More on the Eurasian animal style. Eurasian animal style, here we see on a wooden pail in the kind of Tibetan style, and in the Siberian Altai style. So on the same bucket, we have two very different types of Eurasian animal style art. And of course, East Turkestan, Xinjiang lies between the Altai and Tibet. I wanted to talk a little about the yak because there's a lot we could say about the yak, but I don't have time. And that's okay because now you can just enjoy the images. The yak also was it's a quintessential animal of Upper Tibet, probably all of Tibet, really. Here we have talismans in the form of a yak. I wanted to speak about the horned eagle. The horned eagle is a very important symbol of Upper Tibet. According to Bön text, it was the totem, if you will, of Zhang Zhung. Comes in many different forms. These are rock art. The ones on the far left are among many hundreds of kyung I've seen in real life or in photographs. These are the two of the earliest, and they correspond with the rock art chronologically. I wanted to talk a little about this funerary figure and then the kyung here and a funerary text of 1,000 years ago. But we'll say that for another talk. We have these peacocks, and I wanted to talk a little about how peacock art spread through Upper Tibet and Ladakh, of a very similar type. We'll save that for maybe my 3-hour talk. Maybe if someone invites me to a university, I'll give a series of lectures. But tonight we just have fun and look at the form. And we have here, of course, figures, human figures. Various types. So meet the residents of Upper Tibet, or the gods of Upper Tibet. Here we have fighting figures. Here we have figures beating a drum. We have large hand figures. This one is from probably late Bronze Age in far western Tibet, but they're much more common in Ladakh. And here we have these are bronze figurines, and we see one here with the large hands. And then seminal symbols. We could speak about the swastika, which is the most important single symbol in prehistoric Upper Tibet. I will not talk about epigraphy at all. So let us now go to the concluding remarks. The late prehistoric era in Upper Tibet was characterized by significant cultural complexity, technological sophistication, economic diversification, socio-political differentiation. Cultural complexity. The construction of large residential installations and elaborate necropolises reflect a society in possession of sophisticated cultural traditions, customs, and ideologies. The spectrum of copper, bronze, iron, gold, silver, ceramic, stone, wooden objects, etc., and the use of wool and silk textiles is indicative of a society with a highly developed material culture and life ways. Intricately arrayed burials with various types of inhumations and diverse organic and inorganic deposits allude to a profound system of funerary ritual practices and concepts. The uniform sets of monuments and rock art demonstrate that a well-integrated cultural entity held sway over much of Upper Tibet. Technological sophistication. The construction of large residential installations and elaborate necropolises are reflective of sophisticated design and construction skills and mature architectural traditions. The spectrum of copper, bronze, iron, gold, silver, ceramic, stone, wooden objects, etc., and the use of wool and silk textiles is indicative of well-developed technological capabilities, metallurgical, ceramic, and a variety of industries, extensive raw material sourcing, and relatively refined design and aesthetic tastes. The extensive practice of agriculture, which included the building of irrigation works as well as sheep, goat, and bovid pastoralism, furnished some of the economic impetus for the development of technologies and industries. So, of course, technologies and industries require an economic base. And we go to our next slide here. Economic diversification. Based on proteomic analysis, the rearing of sheep, goats, and yaks was being carried out in Gugay by 1500 to 1300 BCE. Rock art, artifactual, and cross-cultural comparative evidence strongly suggests that horse breeding was introduced in Upper Tibet in the late Bronze Age. Grave finds of horse skeletons in Gugay confirm that horses were being reared in the Iron Age. The cultivation of barley and probably other crops in far western Tibet was active by 220 to 330 CE, according to archaeobotanical data that yielded calibrated radiocarbon dates. However, agriculture was almost certainly being practiced at an earlier date in far western Tibet, but scientific evidence is still being compiled and interpreted. Exotic objects such as silk, glass and stone beads, birch bark, cane, and tea recovered from tombs indicate that long-distance trade and probably other forms of exchange were instrumental in the economic development of far western Tibet. Socio-political differentiation, the founding of large elite monuments such as fortresses and necropolises in juxtaposition with much more humble residential and burial structures indicate that there was a strong degree of social stratification and hierarchical functions. The probable networking of strongholds and necropolises regionally point to a well-evolved polity that had advanced to the level of a chiefdom or proto-state. Long-distance trade and other forms of exchange show that far western Tibet had the wherewithal to project economic power abroad. However, little is yet known how this may have translated into territorial gains or other forms of hegemony. And I talked a little this last time, but we were kind of rudely interrupted in the first half of this talk. Fortunately, this is going perfectly. Anyway, the first half stands beautifully as it is. Is this Zhang Zhung? Okay, which one? The culture, the language, or the polity? Zhang Zhung refers to all three. In the Yungjung Burn religion, Zhang Zhung is first and foremost a religious culture to which many of their traditions and beliefs are traced. The sui generis, residential structures, necropolises, and rock art spell out an integral cultural territory as well, but on empirical grounds. It is clear from bilingual dictionaries, Yungjung liturgical materials, and affiliated languages still spoken in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh that a Zhang Zhung language once existed. The territorial extent of the Zhang Zhung polity prior to the 6th and 7th centuries is unknown. The Zhang Zhung polity, language, and culture can be seen as overlapping geographically, but they are likely to have had varying territorial characteristics. If one takes this traditional ascription, is this Zhang Zhung? Yes and no. If one takes this traditional ascription and applies it generically to most or all of Upper Tibet in the late prehistoric era, then yes. However, If a strict reading of old Tibetan manuscripts and Si and Tang annals is adhered to, this kingdom can be traced back in far western Tibet as early as the late 6th century and during the first half of the 7th century CE. Yet these textual sources provide no information on the temporal depth of Zhang Zhung and very little on its economic and political makeup. The Donghuan manuscripts, the Old Tibetan manuscripts, tell us that it was associated with a king named Lingnashur, and that castles, horses, fish, and deer figured in its economy. As I have advocated, it is most prudent to use the ascription Zhang Zhung in archaeological nomenclature modified by the period and place being specified. The Eastern Changtang and the Sumpa question. Okay, it's the Eastern Changtang, part of Upper Tibetan region that I have surveyed, but with quite different archaeological monuments, appears to have belonged to Sumpa, another of the early proto-states of Tibet, and appears, according to Yungbun sources, to have been affiliated with Zhang Zhung or a vassal of Zhang Zhung, a smaller a state of lesser importance. And of course, and this may be the case because the monuments found in Eastern Changtang are not nearly as extensive or as ambitious as those found further west. So, I think I'm right on time here. I want to thank you all. I want, and wish everyone a happy holiday season. But that is my talk, and I'm happy to take as many questions as people have for me, as much time as we have that the Institute would like to give us. And if you want to know more about my work, you can go to my website, and there is a list of my books and synopsi of the books, etc., and articles. And also, if you want just a quick review, I have a Facebook page, Tibet Archaeology, and I always post bits and bobs there on early Tibet. Well, I want to thank you very much once again, and I'm ready to take any questions if we have them. Very good. Jamyang, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you so much, John. Lovely lecture, lovely images, great overview. Thank you again. And yes, indeed, a lot more to say, and we must invite you back in the future as well. As you said, if there are any questions, you can, I think, raise your hand or ask it directly or in the chat. Otherwise, I'm curious before others jump in. You mentioned peacocks, and you showed. I've obviously heard about the Garuda, famous Zhang Zhung bird, but I'm just wondering, the peacock, is there a similar idea of transformation of poison as you hear in, for example, Indian Tantrism, or is this completely disconnected, the sort of Zhang Zhung symbolism of the peacock?
Well, it's very difficult to discern what the peacock represented in early times. We can again look at the early Tibetan, we can look at the Yungdung Bön texts, which speak of peacocks as a deity and as a warrior spirit, and providing feathers for tulba, which is a kind of feathered cloak that was worn in early times. But it's very hard to know in depth what the symbolism in early times might have been, because we're so far removed from that period. And of course, when these images, when these objects and images were created, there was no written language. I think we had a couple other questions, so please, I can't really see anyone. I probably could. I'm screen sharing, so I mean, if anyone has a question, please ask
Yeah,
me. Or
Laszlo does. He raised his hand. I don't know if he can jump in,
Yes.
Laszlo. Or
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Good
Hi.
evening, everyone. Dr. Bellezza, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask a question related to the object that you showed on slide number 36, that mirror. Yes, that one. So when I look at it, and you mentioned that the animals in the middle circle are unidentified, but it immediately reminded me of the Wheel of Samsara. and then it even looks like there's the pig and the snake and the rooster. So can there be any connection, or is there such early depiction of these three animals, and can they maybe symbolize similar abstract notions like on the wheel of samsara?
I don't think so. I think this mirror. Okay, we don't. This didn't come from a secure context. So how old it exactly is, we don't know. Its general construction, though, would reflect a Iron Age chronology. We look at the outer two rings, and they're all the same animal. My guess is that the central ring, and of course, this is not very detailed here, but the three animals are probably of the same species, of the same type, and not representing the three animals of samsara, the rooster and the peacock, etc. So I don't think so in this case. I think we have to see old Tibet on its own terms. It existed before the rise of Buddhism. Buddhism, of course, suppressed, even destroyed, or absorbed early cultural traditions. But it's best to see this early period on its own terms and not through a Buddhist lens. I think that's the most helpful way of seeing it. Thank you.
Very much.
Any other questions, please? If you have it, I don't see, let me know. You're sharing my screen here, but let me know. Just gentlemen, anyone can speak up. I see a chat here. Thank you very much. Okay, good. And I don't see any other questions at the moment. If there are, please let me know.
I'll ask a question, John.
Yes. Who are you, if I may ask?
William Honeychurch. I think you know me.
Oh, yeah, Bill. Hello. Thank you so much, and everyone else for listening.
Yeah, so John, great talk. I really appreciated it. The stylistic similarities you showed between a lot of the artifact assemblages are indeed shared across this larger area. And I'd like to point out that you should really include a lot more material from Eastern Turkestan, otherwise known as Xinjiang, because all of these things that you're showing, the animal style, the bronzes, the chariot, petroglyphs, all of those are continuous going north into Western Mongolia, Eastern Kazakhstan, right up into Siberia. So the corridor in which these things appear is really quite extensive. And you could bring that out a little bit more by getting into the Eastern Turkestan record. But I was also curious, John, about your comments on buying artifacts that were for sale in markets and then donations to the museums. I'm really curious about, where is this happening? Are these markets in Hong Kong? Are they in China proper? And is the museum you're giving it to the ones in Lhasa, or are they other museums? And do you feel like these museums are using your donations properly and doing scientific-based exhibits?
Two very good points. In an hour I can only do so much. I skimmed over what I have here, but I do talk extensively about East Turkestan in my recent books, and again we'll be talking about it in the 5th volume of my rock art book, because as you rightfully point out, it's a very important bridge between the North Altai and the Central Asian Republic, Siberia, and the Tibetan Plateau. So there's a lot more that could be said about that. This was just, I put some slides together here just to give an hour talk. So that of course could make a very fascinating lecture. The artifacts that I showed that were purchased with monies from friends that I donated, they came from the market in Lhasa, which is the largest antique market in Tibet, on the Tibetan Plateau. There are many others, though. There are antique markets with Tibetan artifacts freely available, particularly in mainland China, in Chengdu and Beijing. And Hong Kong was and Kathmandu were very important markets for antiques in the 1980s to the early 2000s, but they've been eclipsed now because much of the demand for Tibetan antiquities comes from mainland China and the Chinese themselves. I hope that kind of addresses your 2 points.
And what museum are you donating these to?
Oh yes, these were donated to the Tibet Museum in Lhasa.
Okay, and based on Aldendorfer's work, some of the museum exhibits that are shown in Lhasa are really kind of ideologized, politicized. Are you finding that still the case, or are they becoming more based on the science of archaeology?
Well, yes and yes. Everything all China, all archaeology, history, everything else has a political ideological component in the PRC. However, archaeology is progressing, and there's been some landmark studies, particularly in the last several years, in archaeogenetics and metallurgy. So we're seeing, some maturation of the field, but it has a long way to go to catch up with the work that you all are doing in North Eurasia.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I have one. Speaking about archaeometallurgy, I remember reading in India these Melong mirrors were made with 5 different metals, pancha, something, I forget the word in Sanskrit. I'm just wondering if any sort of chemical analysis was made of these melongs, which you mentioned earlier, for example, and if it's a similar recipe, as to say.
Pancha dhatu, yeah, the 5
That's
alloys, yeah, and the ashtadhatu, the other famous alloy of eight metals in the Indian tradition. They informally, there have been analysis conducted by John in a book about Tibetan talismans, tokchas, published in Germany. She gives a metallurgical analysis, spectrographic analysis, and I am in possession of a spectrographic analysis carried out on another collection. I still haven't had time to process. So that'll be a good start. We'll at least know the elemental composition of the metals, but there's so much more that could be done with the metals. We can look at the metallography. We can look at the isotopic sourcing. So there's really this is in its infancy. It really, even though there's been a lot of progress made in Tibetan archaeology, it's really still in its infancy. My work, I guess you could say, is it's a beginning of something. But this is a multi-generational project because ancient Tibet, there was not just civilization, Upper Tibet, but also in northeastern Tibet, the Asha region, southeastern Tibet, the Zhang region, and of course central Tibet, the Pugyalpa, were important centers of early civilization, and it was pretty much forgotten for 1,000 years or so, and it probably taken as a whole, the Tibetan Plateau was as advanced as Persia in early times. More so than places in North Eurasia that were mainly nomadic. It's possible, potentially, that we're looking at a Tibetic civilization, early Tibetic civilization, was as advanced as Persian civilization in terms of its scope and size and monuments, which is saying something. I think Tibetan civilization at the least was, commensurate with the, Celtic, with the Celtic cultural advancement. So we're looking at something, very advanced, not very well known, and still not much interest, which is quite amazing. But Buddhism really has the final say when it comes to Tibet still. And, Buddhism, of course, a marvelous religion, but there's just more to Tibet than Buddhism. And, so I've been bucking the tide for 40 years, basically. I started exploring in the 80s, really 40 years ago, Tibetan Plateau, 1983. And I've been bucking the tide all these years and, getting some headway, but not a lot. It's kind of a shame because I think early Tibet it should be seen in its own right. It's the foundations of Tibet. And as I point out to people, the Vajrayana Buddhism that was, taken up by Tibetans in the 8th century or so, in a very skillful and rapid manner, would not have been possible by a people that were not civilized. It's only because Tibetans were in possession of a sophisticated civilization prior to the advent of Buddhism that they were able to so skillfully and with great fidelity absorb the Vajrayana teachings, which you arguably, at least in a philosophical sense, are the most advanced religious traditions in the world. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes.
You there? Good. Good.
Do we have any more questions, or John, would you like to add anything else before finishing?
No, I know some people joined late. If anyone joined late and there's anything specifically they want to see in the slides, let me know. We'll go back. Otherwise, we can conclude.
Okay, John, then thank you so much on behalf of the Zhang Zhung Institute UK. And thank you everybody for attending. And Happy New Year to all of you and holiday seasons and all. We'll be back in January with our lecture series. So I think most of you heard of this from our newsletter or website, Facebook, Instagram, etc., etc. So we'll keep the calendar updated. We have more talks coming. And again, thank you, John, so much for all your work and for sharing it tonight.